Hi, everyone. Hope you had a nice week. What I'm going to do now is record a short PowerPoint presentation for you that will be an introduction to the topics for this week. So I'll try and do this most weeks, but not necessarily every one. So this is my first one, so please be patient with me, and if it's a little bit rough, hopefully it'll get better over the course of the semester. Thanks. So today we're going to be talking about epidemiology, and epidemiology is part of the fundamental science of public health and is an important part of all aspects of public health, but it's been particularly important as part of COVID-19. So epidemiology is one of those terms that was not a familiar term before COVID-19, but now we hear it all the time. So what is it? It's the study of the distribution and the determinants or the causes of health problems. And very importantly is we study these distributions and causes of ill health so that they can be applied to public health programs that control health problems. So, when we talk about epidemiology, one of the types of epidemiology is what's called surveillance. And surveillance is the systematic science of collecting the number and distribution of cases of a disease like COVID-19. And when we think about public health, the idea is that you use this science to understand what the problem is and then also to understand the causes of that problem in order to think about intervention programs that will solve those problems and to implement them. So the idea of a public health approach using epidemiology is to start with the problem and move towards a response or a solution. So what we're going to be doing in this lecture is really focusing on the science of determining what the problem is and what some of the causes are. So when we think about describing a health problem, any health problem, but in this case we'll be talking about COVID-19, we think about two aspects. The first we call the burden of disease, and that means how common is the disease. And then the second aspect is once we know how common it is, we want to study what we call the distribution. That is, who's getting sick, who's not getting sick, when are they getting sick, and where are they getting sick. And in epidemiology, one of the things that epidemiologists do is they develop hypotheses about the cause of disease. And the fundamental way that epidemiologists test their hypotheses is by making comparisons. So you might want to compare one population to another population, or as you'll see with COVID-19, a very common thing is to compare one state to another state. So when we're thinking about epidemiology, one of the important aspects of this is developing rates. Because if we just count numbers, well, then you can't compare a state like New York or a city like New York City that has a lot of people in it to another city or state that has fewer people living there. So when we develop rates by talking about not just the number of cases, but the number of cases that occur over a certain population, and we call that the population at risk. And then another aspect of rates that is important is that we look not just at the number of cases and the population, but usually it involves understanding a certain period of time. And so therefore, rates in public health are often talking about two. One is called the incidence rate, and the other is called the prevalence rate. So the incidence rate is used to describe the number of new cases over a period of time, and the prevalence rate is used to describe the rate of cases over a longer period of time. So for instance, with COVID-19, a very common measure of the incidence rates is to say how many cases have occurred in the last week or the last 7 days. And the prevalence rate has to do with the number of cases that have occurred in a particular place or in a particular population since the beginning of the pandemic. So again, the incidence rate might measure the number of cases over the last week, and the prevalence rate might measure the rate of disease in a population since the pandemic began, say, in some date in February. And you can see these two different measures can be important for looking at different aspects of the disease. And we'll be talking about specific examples of that in a minute. So again, as I said before, when we apply this idea of incidence and prevalence in COVID-19, the incident rate is the number of new cases in the last 7 days that occurred in a specific population. And the prevalence rate is the total number of confirmed cases in that population, perhaps since a date we may choose as the beginning of the outbreak. And a third measure of a rate that was talked about in the contact tracer course you took is the R statistic, which is used in outbreaks. And that's a rate about how fast the disease is spreading. So we'll be talking about examples of all those things. Some other kinds of rates that have been useful in trying to describe the COVID outbreak or the COVID pandemic is what's called the case fatality rate. So that's the number of people who get sick, who develop COVID, who die from the disease. So of course that's a very important thing, because one of the reasons why people have been so alarmed by COVID-19 is because there's a relatively high number of people who are dying from it compared to, say, the cold or some other kinds of infectious diseases. Another rate that has been really useful is the testing rate. So that's been how many tests are being done in a population. And so that's been a rate that's been very important to measure whether or not there's enough testing being done. Because the idea is that the number of tests in a population should be high enough so that we're able to adequately pick up new cases. And a final rate that people have talked about is the test positivity rate. And that is what proportion of the tests that are done are positive. So if the disease is spreading in one location, then the proportion of tests that are positive will be much higher. And a final concept that is very important in epidemiology is the idea of a case definition. So when I talked about a rate being defined as the number of cases over the population divided by the population at risk, it's very important how we determine what a case is. And this has been very important in the COVID outbreak because as we've learned, and you'll see an example of this in some of the other assignments this week, the types of symptoms associated with COVID have been increasing over time as we learn more about the disease. So when the disease first started, it was defined just as a cough, a fever, and the fact that someone had recently traveled to China. And so that was the initial case definition, but we know now the case definition for someone having COVID or potentially having COVID has expanded dramatically. So obviously the person doesn't need to have traveled to China. And as you saw in your contact tracer class, and you'll see in one of your assignments, the number of symptoms that have been associated with COVID-19 has increased substantially. So another aspect of a case definition is, does the person need to have symptoms, or do they also need to have a positive test for COVID-19? So many times it's been very difficult for people to get tests. The number of tests or access to tests has been limited. So sometimes we want to just depend on people having symptoms that are classic without requiring a positive test. And then the other aspect is perhaps we might just combine symptoms with a person having a history of being exposed to someone who had tested positive for COVID-19. So this idea of the case definition is very important when you develop rates, because you have to be clear how you're defining the case so that your number of cases doesn't vary. For example, in one state, if they required a person to have a COVID-19 positive test, and in another state they didn't require it, then perhaps those rates might not be, you might not be able to compare them across different states. So now I'm going to show you some examples of the way these different kinds of rates have been applied. So this is a map that shows the incidence rate of new cases of COVID-19, and this is from September 12th. And so you can see here, this is the rate of new cases, which they've defined as the cases that have occurred in the last week. And the darker the color, the higher the rate. So we can see North Dakota had the highest rates and Vermont had the lowest rates. But what's interesting here is you can see that when we define the rate as the rate of cases in the last 7 days, so the incidence of cases in the last 7 days, we can see that the highest concentration is in these states, mainly in the middle of the country. There's a few others, but it's mainly characterized by higher rates in the middle of the country. So now I'm going to show you the prevalence rate. So these are the total cases that have occurred since the beginning of the pandemic by states. And so this is all the cases since sometime in February. And so here you can see, yes, there are cases in the middle of the state, but here's when you see that the Northeast and New York also show up as a hotspot. So this is important because we haven't had a lot of cases in the last week, but we had many, many cases in March and April. So if you look at the prevalence rate, you'll see that the Northeast shows up as an important center of cases. But if you look at the incidence rate, the Northeast no longer is important. And so we would want to use these rates for different kinds of descriptions. Obviously, the incidence rate is important to understand what's happening with the disease right now. So the other thing we had talked about